Stop right now. Before you watch another minute, subscribe and hit that like button, because if you stay until the very end of this film, you will understand the single, shocking reason why a communist general in the USSR could earn 1,000 rubles a month, but still envy an average American plumber earning $200. The difference was not the number on the paper, it was the power behind that paper. In the United States, the dollar was a direct key to immediate abundance, a universal contract that guaranteed access to anything from a new car to a simple bag of coffee. This money was real. It represented hours of labor translated into tangible purchasing power within a dynamic, consumer-driven market. In the Soviet Union, the ruble was a currency of fiction, a state-controlled unit of exchange that guaranteed almost nothing. It bought subsidized bread, a tiny apartment, and a spot in the endless queue, but it could not reliably buy the essentials of modern life. It certainly couldn't buy freedom or choice. This comparison is not just about economics. It is about the raw, visceral reality of two different lives. The American who was empowered by his wages, and the Soviet worker who was betrayed by them. This is the truth about the money that mattered and the devastating time tax paid by millions behind the Iron Curtain. The fundamental economic promise of the Soviet state was simple. Guaranteed employment, low prices, and stability. This was the socialist triumph. Money was secondary to social good, and theoretically, the low cost of basic goods meant that everyone could live comfortably. The average Soviet worker in the 1970s earned around 120 to 150 rubles a month on paper. This was sufficient to cover rent, which was negligible, and basic food items, which were heavily subsidized, but this nominal. Affordability masked a brutal reality. The chronic, systemic deficit. The low price was meaningless if the product was not available. Imagine wanting to buy a pair of decent leather shoes in the state store. The price might be set at 50 rubles, affordable in theory, but the store would be empty. The shoes might only appear once every 6 months, necessitating hours of queuing and relying on luck. Meanwhile, on the black market, the same shoes might cost 150 rubles, 3 times the official price, yet instantly available. The American worker earned a higher salary, but crucially, their dollar had real purchasing power. The money in their pocket was immediately convertible into goods and services without the friction of deficit. They paid more for rent and food. Yes, but for that price, they received instant access, variety, and quality. The American system was open about its exchange. You give money, you get goods. The Soviet system was a frustrating gamble. You have money, but you might get nothing. The Soviet ruble was a currency of entitlement to scarcity. The American dollar was a currency of entitlement to abundance, a difference that consumed the daily lives of millions. The most damaging hidden cost of the Soviet economy was the time tax, the hours, days, and weeks that citizens were forced to spend queuing, ochred, maneuvering, and searching for basic necessities. While American wages could be calculated in dollars per hour, the Soviet worker's effective wage had to be calculated against the time stolen by the state's inefficiency. If a Soviet worker earned 150 rubles a month for 160 hours of labor, that's roughly 94 kopecks per hour. Now imagine spending 3 hours standing in line to buy a chicken that cost 2 rubles. The real cost of that chicken, factoring in the time tax, was 2 rubles plus 2.82 rubles in lost labor time, making the true hidden cost much higher than the nominal price. The American shopper, conversely, spent their wages on convenience, saving time. The ability to buy all items in one place, quickly and efficiently, meant that their leisure time was protected. Their working hours were dedicated to productivity, not survival. Logistics. This time tax was a massive drain on the Soviet economy and the national psyche. It diverted energy and focus away from productive work and channeled it into the desperate daily hustle for goods. The American system paid its workers to produce. The Soviet system forced its workers to queue, wasting their most valuable resource, their time. This hidden cost was never accounted for in official Soviet statistics, which boasted low prices and high employment. But for the average person, it was the defining, grinding reality of their economic life, an endless, unpaid labor dedicated simply to getting fed and clothed. The existence of the black market and the hard currency gap utterly exposed the ruble's worthlessness. The ruble was powerful only within the confines of the state system, where prices were controlled and goods were absent. But for anything desirable, Western electronics, decent coffee, high-quality jeans, or imported liquor, the ruble was essentially useless. The real currency of power was the US dollar, or valuta, which could be exchanged for hard-to-get goods and special, closed berioska shops. These dollar stores, originally intended for foreigners and the elite, were stocked with the quality goods the average Soviet citizen dreamed of, yet could not access with their rubles. This created an absurd economic paradox. The state's own system acknowledged that its official currency was inadequate for buying the best products, tacitly admitting the superiority of the capitalist dollar. The black market exchange rate for the dollar was often 10 times the official state rate, demonstrating the true, desperate value of a currency that could actually buy things. A Soviet scientist earning 300 rubles was economically poorer than a student who managed to sell a few dollars received from foreign pen pal. Because the dollar granted access, the ruble did not. This hard currency gap was a massive internal contradiction, demonstrating that the Soviet elite and the common citizen lived in two separate economic realities, one mediated by the universally accepted dollar, the other by the increasingly fictitious ruble. The American worker never questioned if their dollars could buy a television. The Soviet worker knew their rubles probably couldn't. The impact of this economic reality extended directly into labor discipline and motivation. In the United States, wages were directly tied to productivity, quality, and market value. There was a powerful incentive to work harder, smarter, and innovate, because the direct reward was a higher wage that could immediately be used to improve one's life, buy a better car, a larger house, or more leisure. The connection between effort and reward was immediate and tangible. This fueled the relentless drive of the capitalist system. In the Soviet Union, the reward structure was flattened by the state's rigid wage scales and the omnipresent deficits. Why work harder or take risks if the resulting higher ruble salary merely sits in a savings account? Because there's nothing to buy, the economic incentive was crippled. The worker's primary motivation shifted from productivity to securing connections, blat, and minimizing effort. The real currency of value in the Soviet workplace was not the ruble, but the ability to steal time or resources or gain access to a better distribution channel through a manager's favor. Workers would often fabricate items at their factory for personal use or steal parts to sell on the black market. This was known as nezheny, carrying a widespread, essential form of secondary income and survival. This systemic theft and poor productivity were the logical responses to a system that broke the link between effort and reward. The American worker was motivated by the promise of prosperity. The Soviet worker was motivated by the necessity of survival and the pursuit of backdoor access. This economic stagnation was the unavoidable consequence of a currency that had lost its real meaning and a labor system that failed to incentivize its own people. The sheer act of purchasing a major consumer durable, a car, a refrigerator, or even a simple television, exposed the brutal chasm between the dollar and the ruble. In the US, acquiring a car was a process of choice, financing, and delivery. The average worker could save a few months' wages for a down payment, secure a loan from a private bank, and drive away in a brand new vehicle. Selecting the color, features, and model that suited their needs and taste, the transaction was fast, transparent, and driven by a competitive market eager to serve the buyer. In the USSR, buying a car was a feat of engineering, finance, and political patience. First, the Soviet citizen had to save for years, as consumer credit was nearly non-existent and the ruble's purchasing power for large items was minimal. Second, they had to place an order and be added to a state waiting list that could last 7 to 10 years. The model was often non-negotiable. The color was whatever the factory produced, and the delivery date was a distant promise. The worker had the rubles, but the state controlled the supply, making the money irrelevant. A refrigerator or a decent washing machine followed a similar pattern. The wait times were frustrating, the quality was questionable, and the consumer had zero choice. This difference created two distinct consumer mindsets. The American was a master of their economic destiny, choosing and buying freely. the Soviet citizen was a permanent supplicant, waiting patiently for the state to grant them permission to spend the money they had already earned. The American system was built on instant gratification, the Soviet system on delayed, uncertain allocation. This process alone was a massive psychological burden, constantly reminding the Soviet citizen that their economic freedom was an illusion, that their savings were simply numbers waiting for state approval. The concept of consumer debt and credit further defined the two economic lives in the United States. Consumer credit was a vast, lubricating engine of the economy. Credit cards, car loans, and installment plans allowed the average family to access goods and services immediately, spreading the cost over time and fueling continuous demand. This system was built on the fundamental trust in the individual's future earning power and the stability of the dollar. While it carried risks, it maximized immediate access to comfort and wealth, giving the consumer enormous leverage. In the USSR, consumer debt and credit were virtually absent and ideologically discouraged. The official view was that consumer debt was a capitalist vice, exploiting the worker. The reality was that the centralized state system simply did not trust its citizens or the ruble enough to facilitate private lending. This forced the Soviet citizen to rely solely on cash savings for every major purchase, creating a culture of forced thrift and massive delay in acquiring essential items. The American citizen could walk into a store, buy a new television with a credit card, and enjoy it immediately. The Soviet citizen saved rubles for 2 years, only to find the television model was outdated and required a 6-month wait to receive. The absence of credit was not a moral victory for socialism. It was a structural barrier to consumption and comfort, trapping the Soviet citizen in a lower, less flexible economic reality. The ruble was not just restricted by deficit, it was restricted by the complete absence of a modern, functioning financial system designed to empower the consumer. The difference in how labor was valued across professions reveals the political prioritization of the Soviet state. In the US, a skilled plumber, electrician, or auto mechanic could command high wages, reflecting the market value of their skills and the high consumer demand for quality service. The wage reflected the value delivered to the consumer, allowing these blue-collar professionals to achieve a solid middle-class lifestyle, often with the ability to afford a suburban home and all its amenities. In the USSR, the wage structure was inverted. Political loyalty, ideological importance, and proximity to military-industrial complexes were often valued far higher than service or consumer-facing skills. A factory worker producing steel for military tanks might earn more than a doctor, and a plumber or repairman was notoriously underpaid, reflecting the state's low valuation of consumer comfort. This inversion led to systemic problems. If a plumber earned a low state wage, their incentive to perform quality, timely work was minimal, leading to chronic shortages of decent repair services and a dependence on the black market for quality labor. The best professionals often left their state jobs to work na levo on the side for much higher, unofficial fees paid in cash or barter goods. The ruble paid officially by the state was not reflective of the real value of the labor. This contrast is stark. The American system rewarded value to the consumer, the Soviet system rewarded value to the central plan, leading to excellent tanks and terrible plumbing. This hidden reality made the lives of Soviet citizens perpetually inconvenient, forcing them to rely on unofficial, often illegal, means just to maintain their basic appliances and living spaces, proving the official wage structure was a fiction. The concept of saving and investment was radically different and exposed the vulnerability of the ruble. The American citizen could save their dollars in commercial banks, invest in the stock market, or buy real estate. Their savings were protected by a relatively stable, transparent financial system, and their investments offered the potential for genuine growth and increased generational wealth. Their money had future power. The Soviet citizen could only save their rubles in the state-run Sperkassa savings bank, which offered minimal token interest rates. There was no stock market, no private real estate investment, and few mechanisms to protect savings from sudden state-imposed devaluation, which happened multiple times throughout Soviet history. Essentially, the Soviet savings bank was a safe place to hold cash, but it was not a vehicle for creating wealth. The ruble had no future power beyond its current nominal value. This was not accidental. The system discouraged private capital formation to ensure the state remained the sole allocator of wealth and opportunity. Compare this to the growth potential of the American workers' savings. The American workers' money worked for them, generating passive income and stability. The Soviet workers' money simply waited, losing value relative to the goods they desired. The ultimate symbol of the ruble's fragility was the covert possession of gold or US dollars, the two assets that Soviet citizens trusted more than their own national currency. The fact that an entire population hedged its economic security against the currency of its ideological enemy was the single greatest admission of the ruble's failure. The ultimate measure of purchasing power is not the cost of basic food, but the accessibility of technology and personal luxury. The American economy, driven by intense competition, made consumer electronics, appliances, and personal luxuries rapidly accessible and affordable. New models of televisions, refrigerators, and high-fidelity sound systems arrived yearly, constantly improving quality and driving down real cost. The worker could buy a high-tech appliance with a reasonable amount of saved dollars. The Soviet economy treated technology as a strategic asset, prioritizing military and heavy industry production, meaning consumer electronics were chronically outdated, expensive in real terms, and extremely difficult to acquire. The Soviet television was often decades behind its Western counterpart. The quality was poor, and the waiting list was long, forcing the citizen to spend massive amounts of income and time just to obtain a basic piece of technology. This technological gap was a constant, visible source of resentment. The American workers' purchasing power granted them immediate access to the best global technology, improving their leisure and convenience. The Soviet workers' rubles granted them access to yesterday's technology, often only after a frustrating wait. This disparity highlighted the deep structural difference. The U.S. economy was built to serve the consumer's desire for innovation. The Soviet economy was built to ignore it, focusing instead on political and military priorities. The cash in the Americans' hand bought modernity. The cash in the Soviets' hand bought obsolescence and a place in line. The state's obsession with price control was the primary structural flaw that crippled the Soviet ruble. Guaranteeing chronic deficit, the Communist Party, for propaganda purposes, fixed the prices of essential goods, bread, milk, rent, at artificially low levels. This was designed to show the world that socialism provided a comfortable life accessible to every worker, but the economic consequence was catastrophic. By keeping the price of, for instance, high-quality meat low, the state created massive, insatiable demand that the inefficient collective farming system could never satisfy. This demand constantly outstripped the subsidized supply, leading directly to the empty shelves and the necessity of the queue. The price signal, the essential feedback mechanism of any healthy economy, was broken. In the US, if the demand for a certain brand of coffee surged, the price would rise, signaling producers to increase supply or motivating competitors to enter the market. This dynamic ensured that supply eventually met demand. Even if at a higher price, the Soviet system ignored price signals entirely, maintaining the fiction of low prices while the real cost was paid in time, anxiety, and the psychological burden of the deficit. The ruble was powerful enough to purchase the subsidized item, but the item itself was a phantom, existing only on paper and in state statistics. The American worker understood that price reflected availability and quality. The Soviet worker understood that price reflected political dogma, completely detached from reality. This systematic manipulation of prices was the single biggest lie perpetrated by the Soviet economy, turning every purchase into a complex logistical battle rather than a simple transaction. The professional landscape reveals a profound difference in social mobility and personal ambition. The American system, while marked by class differences, provided clear, albeit challenging, pathways for social mobility based on individual talent, education, and entrepreneurial risk. A skilled worker could start their own business, grow it, and achieve substantial wealth. using their dollars to buy not just goods, but opportunity, better education for their children, investment in the stock market, or a move to a better neighborhood. The path was meritocratic and open to individual pursuit. The Soviet system promised universal equality and opportunity, but the reality was a rigid, stratified structure where professional advancement was often tied to party membership, political connections, and adherence to the state line, not purely to merit. An engineer, a scientist, or even a skilled doctor could only advance so far without the necessary blad, and the state salary caps ensured that even the most brilliant individuals could not accumulate significant private wealth or leverage their ruble earnings into true economic freedom. The Soviet workers' ambition was often truncated by the system, limited to moving up a few notches on the state salary scale or securing a slightly better apartment through a manager's favor. The ruble was a controlled distribution mechanism, not a tool for genuine self-advancement. The American dollar was a symbol of potential. The Soviet ruble was a symbol of limits. This systemic stagnation of ambition led to widespread cynicism and the flight of the most talented individuals into the shadow economy, where their skills were finally paid at their real, market-driven value. The simple act of using money exposed the fundamental difference in the infrastructure of finance and service. The American economy was characterized by ubiquitous, efficient financial services, private banking, credit unions, ATMs, and eventually credit cards, all designed to make transactions seamless, instant, and private. The dollar was a fluid, functional medium of exchange. The service economy was vast, competitive, and designed for customer satisfaction. The Soviet financial infrastructure was rudimentary and state-controlled, dominated by the scarcity, and was designed for control and accumulation, not for convenience. Most transactions were conducted in cash, and the concept of customer service was virtually non-existent, reflecting the lack of competition and the state's indifference to the consumer's experience. The most glaring contrast was the absence of a repair or service economy. If an American appliance broke, a competitive private market of repairmen would bid for the job, offering fast, quality service paid for with dollars. If a Soviet appliance broke, the citizen entered the Kafkaesque state repair system, facing long wait times, indifferent service, and a chronic lack of spare parts. The ruble was powerless to command quality service or prompt attention, forcing the Soviet citizen to become a reluctant expert in DIY repair or to rely on the unofficial na-levo labor market. The American dollar bought efficiency and service. The Soviet ruble bought frustration and delay. This difference extended the hidden cost of the Soviet economy far beyond the empty shelves and into the daily inconvenience of maintaining a life with unreliable goods. The psychological value of money was radically different in the two societies. For the American, the dollar represented independence, the freedom to choose, the ability to protect one's family, and a symbol of personal achievement. The money itself was a tool for empowerment, confidence, and consumption. This psychological connection fueled the consumer engine of the U.S. economy. The Soviet ruble, for the common citizen, represented obligation and necessity. It was the required token for state, provided housing and subsidized bread, but it offered minimal empowerment beyond those basic necessities. The ruble did not buy choice, it did not reliably buy quality, and it certainly did not buy freedom. The chronic deficit meant that Soviet citizens developed a deep, almost instinctual distrust of their own currency's purchasing power. They understood that connections, were often a more valuable currency than the ruble itself. This internal devaluation of their money led to a complex system of bartering and unofficial exchange, where goods and favors were traded directly, bypassing the state's controlled monetary system. The ultimate psychological betrayal was the realization that their hard-earned wages were often incapable of fulfilling simple, reasonable desires. A new bicycle for a child, a decent cut of meat for a holiday, or a reliable pair of shoes. The American citizen felt empowered by their money. The Soviet citizen felt constrained by it, constantly reminded that the state, not their money, held the true power of allocation. The final economic hammer blow to the Soviet system was the systemic debt to the West. the continuous need to import vast quantities of Western grain and, paradoxically, consumer goods to maintain even the minimal illusion of stability and feed its own population, the Soviet Union, despite its vast resources and ideological claims of self-sufficiency, relied on selling gold, oil, and strategic resources to the capitalist West to earn the hard currency, dollars and Deutschmarks, necessary to buy grain and technology. The ruble was not accepted on the international market, a final, damning judgment on its non-convertibility and lack of real economic value. This massive economic hypocrisy, relying on the strength of the dollar and the efficiency of the capitalist market to sustain the socialist state, was the ultimate hidden cost of the centrally planned economy. The American workers' dollar contributed to a strong national economy, which in turn provided global access and high-quality goods. The Soviet workers' ruble, earned through mandatory labor, propped up a system that had to secretly trade with its enemy for basic survival. The average Soviet citizen paid for the failure of their economic system twice. First through the time tax of the queues, and second through the denial of quality goods that were constantly exported or reserved for the elite. This dual betrayal revealed the truth. The ruble was a currency of internal oppression, and the dollar was the currency of global reality. The great ideological divide over unemployment provides the final, chilling contrast in labor and money. The Soviet system proudly proclaimed that it had eliminated unemployment, guaranteeing a job for every citizen. This was touted as a massive social victory over the instability and perceived cruelty of Western capitalism, where cycles of boom and bust left millions without work. The propaganda was successful, painting the Soviet citizen as secure, but this guarantee of employment came at a profound, hidden cost. Massive structural inefficiency and mandatory low productivity. The state employed millions in jobs that were essentially meaningless, keeping people busy but not productive, creating a vast army of softly unemployed. People who showed up to work but lacked the resources, tools, or incentives to perform their jobs effectively. The Soviet factory often employed 3 people to do the work of 1, simply to maintain the illusion of full employment. This inefficiency was a crippling drain on the economy, and the ruble paid to these superfluous workers was merely a subsidy to maintain social peace. The American system, while accepting temporary periods of higher unemployment, focused relentlessly on efficiency, productivity, and the creation of high-value jobs that justified their wages. The dollar earned by the American worker reflected real, measurable value added to the economy. The Soviet ruble often reflected a social mandate, disconnected from economic reality. The difference was clear. The American worker had the freedom to choose their employer and the risk of losing their job. The Soviet worker had the security of mandatory employment and the certainty of low wages and perpetual deficit. One system rewarded high performance, the other punished unemployment, regardless of performance, forcing millions into roles of economic fiction. The concept of tipping in customer service perfectly illustrates the difference between an incentive-driven economy and a bureaucratic one. In the United States, tipping was and remains a core component of the service industry, a direct financial mechanism that ties the quality of service to the worker's income. The dollar paid as a tip is a transparent, immediate reward for good performance, creating a competitive environment where waiters, barbers, and taxi drivers are motivated to satisfy the customer. This is a direct expression of the consumer's power within the market. The Soviet system, under the ideology of collective equality, had no formal tipping culture. Tipping was often frowned upon as a bourgeois excess, and the state-employed service workers received a fixed, low salary, entirely disconnected from their quality of work. The result was famously indifferent, often rude. Service across every consumer-facing sector. Why should a shop clerk or a repairman bother to be polite or efficient when their fixed ruble salary remains the same regardless of customer satisfaction? This lack of incentive created a culture of passive hostility, where the consumer was viewed as an inconvenience, not a client to be served. The contrast is stark. The American customer was king, using the dollar to command service. The Soviet citizen was a supplicant, forced to deal with the apathy of a state bureaucracy The only way to bypass this indifference was, once again, through blat, or a small, unofficial bribe, na la pu, proving that the official ruble was useless in demanding courtesy, and that the only effective currency was an illegal, market-driven incentive. The pervasive reliance on rationing and coupon systems further exposed the ruble's failure to act as a reliable currency, while the American dollar maintained its universal fungibility, the ability to be exchanged for any good or service. The Soviet ruble was often subject to internal restrictions. During periods of acute deficit, the state was forced to introduce rationing systems, issuing special coupons or taloni for basic goods like meat, butter, and sugar. These coupons effectively became a secondary currency, a necessary permit to use the rubles you already earned. The rubles were useless without the taloni, and the taloni were useless without the rubles. This dual system was the ultimate admission that the Soviet currency had lost its meaning. The state could not trust the ruble to manage the distribution of goods efficiently, resorting instead to a medieval system of controlled allocation. The American consumer never had to worry about coupons for basic necessities. Their dollar was sufficient because the market ensured supply. The Soviet consumer had to worry not only about having enough rubles, but also about obtaining the correct coupons, ensuring they were still valid, and presenting them at the right place at the right time. This was a massive logistical headache that added another layer of anxiety to daily life, proving that the Soviet promise of economic security was a paper fiction, constantly undermined by the need for a secondary, state-controlled currency of scarcity. The taloni system was a visible, humiliating sign that the central plan had failed to provide, forcing the state to treat its population like wartime rations recipients decades after the war had ended. The overall feeling of financial optimism versus stagnation provides the clearest psychological contrast. The American citizen, buoyed by the prospect of rising wages, accessible credit, and a thriving stock market, often felt optimistic about their financial future, seeing their dollar savings as a growing asset that could secure their children's future and provide a comfortable retirement. The future was seen as economically expansive. The Soviet citizen faced a financial landscape defined by stagnation, lack of opportunity for private growth, and the perpetual fear of sudden economic policy shifts that could devalue their savings. Their ruble earnings, while guaranteed, offered no real hope for significant improvement or wealth accumulation. The lack of private property and transferable assets meant that the Soviet citizen was forced to live in a state of permanent economic compression. Their goal was merely to maintain the current standard of living, not to dramatically improve it. This pervasive lack of financial optimism was a silent, crushing force, preventing the risk-taking and innovation that fuels a modern economy. The American dollar was a ticket to a better tomorrow. The Soviet ruble was a coupon for today's subsidized existence. The American citizen worked to build wealth. The Soviet citizen worked to survive the waiting lists. This difference in financial psychology, built over decades, ultimately determined the fate of the two competing systems as one embraced the future and the other ossified in a stagnant past. The hidden reality of the Soviet ruble, the crushing burden of the time tax, and the hypocrisy of the hard currency black market exposed the core contradiction of the socialist project. The promise was that the state would liberate the worker from the exploitation of the market. The reality was that the state replaced market risk with bureaucratic cruelty and chronic deficit. The Soviet worker was paid a low, controlled wage that was artificially inflated by subsidized prices, but this payment was essentially worthless for anything outside the most basic state-controlled necessities, forcing the citizen into a perpetual, exhausting quest for goods in the shadow economy. The American dollar was not perfect. It was subject to inflation and market cycles, but it was honest. It was a direct measure of value that translated instantly into goods, choice, and convenience. The ruble was a lie, a tool used to mask the structural poverty and technological backwardness that defined daily life. Behind the Iron Curtain, the difference was not in the number of zeros on the banknote, but in the power of the paper. One currency represented the freedom to choose, the other represented the necessity to wait. This silent, Economic oppression was more damaging to the Soviet system than any Western missile because it destroyed the faith of the people in the very system that claimed to protect them. What do you think? Which currency, the dollar or the ruble, represented true economic freedom? And what was the most valuable thing lost by the Soviet worker in the queues? Let me know in the comments below.